All right. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. Welcome to the fourth and final event of the USC EASC New Book Series on Modern China. My name is Li-Ping Chen. I'm the Postdoctoral Scholar and Teaching Fellow in the East Asian Studies Center here at the University of Southern California. My research focuses on Taiwanese writer in transnational context, and I teach East Asian Humanities and Cultural Studies at USC. This monthly series introduces some of the latest publications in the Chinese studies about sonic networks, cultural memory, literary production, and diaspora history, such as the one we have today. If you missed any of the book talks, you can find the recordings in the USC EASC YouTube channel. I wanted to thank EASC Director Sonia Lee and also the Associate Director Grace Ru for their great support for this series, and also the wonderful EASC staff, Jasmine and Alex, for their help. In case some of you might not be able to stay with us till the end of the book talk today, I am honored and thrilled to announce that in fall 2021, EASC will have a new series on Sinophone studies online in Zoom. More information will be available later. We hope to continue the inspiring conversation that we have here in the Modern Chinese series in spring 2021 and the Sinophone conference next week, all the way into fall 2021. Today's talk, I believe, is a great transition and an important connection from our Chinese series to the Sinophone series. I mean, we didn't really plan the schedule, but somehow it just worked beautifully. So today we are delighted to have Professor Shelly Chan here with us to talk about her book. She is Associate Professor of Modern Chinese History at UC Santa Cruz. Professor Chan specializes in Chinese migration and diaspora in transnational and global perspectives, and is currently working on the rise of Nanyang as a maritime region in the 20th century. Her recent publications include The Case for Diaspora, a temporal approach to the Chinese experience, an article in the Journal of Asian Studies, as well as the book she is discussing today, Diaspora's Homeland, Modern China in the Age of Global Migration, which was published by Duke University Press in 2018. Diaspora's Homeland was shortlisted for the International Convention for Asia Scholars Humanities Prize in 2019. She received her PhD from UCSC, where she teaches now, and have previously taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and University of Victoria. Our discussant today is Professor Huei-Ying Kuo. She is Associate Research Professor of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. Her research interests include Chinese diaspora, business network, colonial empires, nationalism, transnationalism, and maritime East Asia in world historical and comparative perspectives. Her articles have appeared in many peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes. In addition, Professor Guo is the author of Networks Beyond Empires, Chinese Business and Nationalist Activity in the Hong Kong-Singapore Corridor, 1914 to 1941, which was published by Brill in 2014 and translated into Chinese this February. So now let me say a little bit about the format for today. Today's event will begin with the author's presentation and continue with discuss and comment. After that, we will move on to the Q&A section. At any point during the talk, feel free to submit your question to the Q&A box. And if possible, please include information about your affiliation. The Q&A function is in the control panel in the lower part of your Zoom screen. There, you will also find the closed caption function. Please note that the live transcript is automatically generated by Zoom. So that said, without further ado, Professor Chan.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, East Asian Studies Center here at USC for hosting this talk. I'm so excited to be here with you on a Friday afternoon. And thanks for joining us. And I'm also looking forward to hearing thoughts from Professor Kuo on the book. So before I begin, let me bring up my PowerPoint so that you all have something to look at. All right. So here's my book, Diaspora's Homeland, Modern China in the Age of Global Migration. It came out in 2018, published by Duke. It's a pre-pandemic book, so I'm actually very grateful to be included here in this series for new books. As a first-time author, I must say that I'm glad to be sharing with you, what's in the book, and also that hopefully the book will remain on people's radar for a little bit longer. So I wanted to give you a sense of the book process very, very quickly, and then I'll go on to discussing the goals and the arguments that I make in this book. So as a first-time author, like many people, the book began as a dissertation. I was graduating at the time in 2009. I did additional research, rewriting a number of chapters, and also to do some reconceptualization of the work. So the result, or actually the goals that I had in mind at the time, was to write Diaspora back into Chinese history, to really conceive of a Chinese history that integrates diaspora more fully. And the reason is that I found diaspora is often too narrowly understood or peripheralized in nation-centered narratives, often appearing as an object of state mobilization rather than as a force of its own. And on the contrary, immigrants actually enmeshed China in all kinds of global circulations, transformed China's relations with many other places, and injected into Chinese life new blends of politics, economics, and culture. So the diaspora-homeland relationship, which is my focus, I argue, was core to China's development in a global system. So the second goal that I have as I was trying to rewrite and reformulate the dissertation into a book is to think about, interpret diaspora through Chinese experiences. Now, some of the debates and controversies about diaspora were pretty well known. Often the concept was criticized for being, too homogenizing or essentializing. And then also people ask if it's a concept that is primarily designed to explain Jewish experiences, African experiences, and others. Wouldn't it be wrong and inappropriate to apply it to the Chinese? So my starting point is a little different. I was trying to be mindful of all these criticisms, but I also asked, what can we learn about diaspora through the Chinese, who were one of the greatest migratory peoples in the world? And some of the concepts that we already have developed to explain phenomenon related to them, such as the overseas Chinese or Chinese overseas, was no less problematic. It also assumes a kind of unity. So it's important that, to me, that we begin with, kind of asking empirically and socially the contributions that the study of the Chinese can make to Jewish, African, Indian experiences that form the basis of diaspora studies. What kind of concepts, methods, interpretive frameworks could we develop from it? And in the process of doing so, I discovered with my findings that a temporal approach is actually pretty central to the conceptualization of the Chinese diaspora. And a temporal approach that focuses on moments rather than communities could be exceptionally or unusually fruitful. And by that, I mean that we focus more on the role of historical process and political contingency in the formulation of the Chinese diaspora. So that, so on the road to the book, I wrote this article, The Case for Diaspora. I tried to deal with the criticisms by leading scholars about the concept of diaspora, but I also try to be sensitive to this complexity of social realities, just in case, because if the history of Chinese migration and diaspora really went on for centuries, right? There's a long history, vast scope worldwide. There is a lot of room still to explore the complexity and the diversity, contradictions of these experiences that are lived and material. So in the article, I try to use the story of Li-Ping Chen or Li-Ping Chen, Baba Chinese from Singapore, who was also the founding president of Xiamen University, to look at his attempts to articulate a reconnection with China, and also his story, how it was used as a vehicle to imagine a kind of reconnection. So in the article, I argue that diaspora is less a collection of communities than a series of moments in which reconnections with a putative homeland take place.
Shelly,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but I believe your slides is now still on the first page. That's the book cover one.
Oh no. Let me do this again.
Sounds good.
Can you see it?
Yes.
One? Okay. So now, let's fast forward to the book that came out in 2018. So the framing that I use, I attributed to Adam McEwen. The age of global migration refers to the century of time from 1840 to 1940. And it's a time where over 20 million Chinese migrated overseas. Is the third largest exodus behind Europeans and Indians. It was century long and worldwide. So diaspora and migration offered a way to connect Chinese history with global history. And it is because Chinese mass emigration was spurred by industrial capitalism, colonialism, nationalism, while China at the same time was going through some radical transformations of its own. So this dual perspective is necessary for us to be able to see a constellation of moving interdependent elements. And it also allow us to go against bounded ideas of a national territory and a national chronology. So I want to comment a little bit about the design of the book, the cover that I so love very much. It was not done especially for me, but the Duke University Press was able to find a piece of abstract art that is from the artist Bailey Liu, who was able to, I think that the picture really, the drawing, which is actually markings of incense on paper, conveys a movement so beautifully and articulates a sense of process of time and space. So my central question in the book that drives the analysis and the argument is that I ask, how did Chinese mass immigration change China? So to that, I argue that China became ever more fragmented and networked. Mass immigration caused the splitting and proliferation of Chinese times and spaces that occasionally intertwine. And as I've said before, immigrants drew China into the orbits of empires, markets, and nations far beyond its shores. This happened while China also struggled for nationhood and modernity. And during this process, Chinese leaders and thinkers repeatedly encountered many global dialogues, entered many global dialogues where they also encounter the significance of Chinese immigration to them. So these topics of interest were slavery and free labor, migration and colonization, Confucianism and Christianity, family and gender roles, socialism and capitalism. So diaspora in the Chinese mode, which is the thing that I also set out to understand, was that there is something that has been overlooked and not often commented on, is the construction of a temporality that's embedded in this idea of the diaspora, Huaqiao. And while there are many debates about the Hua, the Chineseness of it, and the Qiao part of it, which is a sense of being temporary, was sometimes only mentioned in passing. That means Chinese people were supposed to be sojourning. But I also try to go a little bit further than that. I ask if the diaspora was being imagined as temporarily in its existence, then what gets created as permanent? So that question opens up a whole set of issues for me. And I think it's quite important that we think this relationship, kind of as a pair between the diaspora and the homeland. And that is how diaspora in the Chinese mode helped produce the idea of a permanent homeland, a 祖国, or give it a semblance of permanence. So the function of diaspora in this century of history that I study is that it's a device, is a vehicle to order different temporalities and spatialities into a single whole, even as neither China nor the diaspora stood still. Actually, the two things are in continual flux. The diaspora as a concept helps give a stabilizing effect to this relationship. And it's highly problematic, of course. What then I conclude from that is that it is possible then to interpret diaspora temporally as time and moments to stress the importance of process and contingency. This is not really in the book, but I want to help us visualize what I mean. And I think about this a lot as an analogy when I was writing the book. And what I mean by diaspora time and diaspora moments here is that diaspora time is a slow-moving, largely silent condition. It refers to how social worlds were regulated by different things that are not often grabbing a lot of attention. Life stages, family time, work time, all of these things that render diaspora as kind of a silent long wave, and happen slowly and often without attracting much attention. Diaspora moments, however, refer to a series of recurring disjunctions that impinge on the present and that demand a response, a recalibration, a resolution of some sort. It could be visualized as these sharp spikes. And there's a great sense of things getting out of joint and that there's a possibility of something changing and restructuring. So what that gives us is a kind of a conception of a world that's fractured yet connected. And I think we can think about China that way through this diaspora homeland relationship or dialectic. And my approach does not decenter China, but rather views it through the global webs and circuits where it has belonged. So just very quickly about the chapters in the book. There are 5 of them. I'll just say one line about each so that we have enough time for discussion. Chapter 1, which I call A Great Convergence, is about how indentured coolie migration to the Americas embedded China in regimes and temporalities of labor, diplomacy, and sovereignty, a meeting of temporalities of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism that led China to end a formal emigration ban in 1893 and call for returns. Chapter 2 looks at, and it's called Colonists of the South Seas, how Chinese intellectuals produce a massive scholarship on the overseas Chinese in response to an intensification of Japan's imperialism toward colonial Southeast Asia. Their narratives try to subsume emigrant temporalities into a national chronology heavily influenced by colonial thought. A Confucius from Afar, chapter 3, returns to this guy I've been writing, Li-Ping Chen, and his Confucian revivalism. And his effort was to try to make it more authentic, yet also modern. So paradoxically, he tries to incorporate global ideologies of race, gender, religion, and science in his refashioning of Chinese traditional culture. Chapter 4, because I've seen a number of reviews on my book already, and I think that the thing that I've heard from reviewers that they really like this chapter, and maybe also chapter 5. These 2 chapters were some of their favorites. The Women Who Stayed Behind, how Mao's China reconciled. Actually, both the chapters focus on how Mao's China reconciled national time with diaspora time. In Emigrant South China, the socialist campaign of liberating women from their unhappy marriages to overseas men, here I looked at how these efforts backfired. And in chapter 5, Homecomings, it is about the period of decolonization and Cold War struggles in the 50s and 60s, and how they created a vast reverse migration from Southeast Asia to Mao's China, itself also a new formation. So at the beginning, returnees were allowed to remain temporarily outside socialist time to allow a future reintegration. But as socialism got into high gear and accelerated, as well as waves of return migration continued, this space of accommodating the diaspora collapsed and disappeared. So my conclusion is that as a homeland nation, which I'm trying to kind of see China that way, and I argue that China became a diaspora's homeland in this age of global migration, is made, it's not given, it's not found. And through this perspective, we could see a different kind of China, a different picture, whereas it was multispatial, polyrhythmic, and always incomplete as a result. All these elements and fragments were moving, and it requires periodic reorganization. And so it's always incomplete, and it follows this pattern of rupture, transformation, and recombination. If we see it in a kind of long historical view. Diaspora moments review a bottom-up dynamic, going back to my analogy of earthquakes. So it's a complication of kind of something that was silent and not registering, but it's not existing, it's actually there. So it goes against a kind of very common model of studying Chinese immigrants and China, the center-periphery model. And this is something that I think highlights how this diaspora homeland dialectic was something that not just shuns and sometimes rips through linear plot lines shaking up the center periphery model. Now, despite all of that, the desire to unify fragments continues, it endures. The efforts, desire to fix something in time and space and that would transcend all the divides because that be caused by movements, they can be seen, often very much. And often their success is provisional and contested, yet also exists as a very powerful imagination. So I want to just end my part of the presentation with some pictures that, when my book first came out, me and some other authors had a book party. We made our books into cakes so that we can also eat them at a local bookstore. So here's our books as book cakes, and then my book as a cake too. And here's kind of the aftermath of it. So even though I cannot offer you cake this time, I hope that we can still have a very nice conversation. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Awesome, thank you, Professor Chen. And it certainly looks delicious. I mean, the book cake. And so thank you for this wonderful overview of your book, and especially in terms of how diaspora and also China intersect, but also at times confront each other in the global system and global network as well. So now I will be turning over the time to our discussant, Professor Kuo, today.
So thank you for inviting me for this very interesting event. I enjoy reading Shelly's book very much. So I think my comment would be more like to talk about the contribution of the book in reference to the whole entire paradigm of Chinese diaspora. And I know that Shelly, as a historian of modern China, your concern will be more about the transformation of China. But I would like to really put into the conversation with the recent booming studies about Chinese diaspora, in particular in relation to Professor Shi Shumei's comments against diaspora, but you apply the very same jargon. So I want to see how much we can gain from still retaining the term diaspora in our studies of transnational Chineseness. Okay, so the book provides a very exciting outside-in perspective to examine how the flows of migrants from China which helped the transformation of China in the long 19th century, or the century between 1860s and 1960s. And Shelly featured Chinese diaspora, which has often been used interchangeably with the term of Chinese overseas or overseas Chinese. And when the scholar Wang Gengwu coined this term overseas Chinese in the 1970s, the state of Malaysia just stipulated diplomatic ties with the People's Republic of China. As one put it at that time, quote, now that China has largely achieved its aim of conciliation with the ASEAN country, it remains to be seen if China might now act differently toward people of Chinese origin who have settled in the region and began to urge them to act on China's behalf in any way, and whether the local citizens of Chinese descent themselves right now rediscover their Chineseness and slow down, if not stop, the process of assimilation altogether, end quote. After all, in Wang's word, quote, Chinese influence in the neighborhood must inevitably grow. When Chinese influence is overwhelming, those who still wish to do so may identify with China again, end quote. And until recently, the concern over PRC's overseas Chinese work have also aroused scholars to look at the relationship between ethnic Chinese residing abroad and China, and whether, when, and why those who or whose ancestors left China will still consider the country their 祖国, or become a booming and sensitive research topic. And in this book, Chen introduced the fresh perspective of temporality to elaborate the connection between the state of China and those who left it. And I organized my comments about the book based on how Shelly contribute to these two, what I consider as two major arguments in the book. First, the diaspora moment means that the time when migrants from China consider China as a 祖国, so that is the connection. I like her contribution of emphasizing that into a very historical contingent styles against the very essentialist argument. And the second part of the book, I would clarify as that chapter 2 and 3 that analyze the narration of the diaspora. And because diaspora is defined as the moment when the migrant decided their homeland is in China, so the narration of diaspora will be the analysis about diaspora connection with China. And so for the first argument, I mean, that is the exciting contribution of chapter 1 called the Great Convergence. And the chapter argued that Qing state's concern over its migrant workers in the America will lead to the creation of modern state sovereignty in China. And here she provides a fresh perspective to understand Xue Fucheng's edit in 1893 regarding free migration. She argued that the edit was not about free emigration, but for welcoming return with a passport. My question to this issue is about the representation of such Mandarin migrants encounter. To be sure, most migrants out of China in the late 19th century and early 20th century remain to be in Asia. So my finding is that, for example, like Xue Fucheng in 1890s, and he had another encounter, not about the issue in relation to the migrant workers in the America, in South America, but with the guy called Dam Kim Jong in Siam. And Dam Kim Jong was a Paranaga Hogan. His father, Tan Tok-sung, whose statue is now standing by the Singapore River since the bicentennial anniversary of Raffles endings in 2019. And Tan Kim Jong belonged to that kind of Hogan Paranaga community in Singapore, and he extended his business and political influence to Saigon and Siam without any help from the Chinese state. So although through a translator, Xue Fucheng was able to learn about Dam Kim Jong's commitment to local Chinese schools and concern of Qing China's reform. So I think my question is that if we consider those overseas Chinese, those who reside abroad, but who still consider themselves Chinese, I mean, does that actually mean that they still think China as their homeland or 祖国? I mean, so what I mean is that once Chinese identity be just about ethnic type, but not about a political allegiance with China. And so, I mean, that is my question. I think just like Shelly mentioned that reviewer love chapter 4 and chapter 5. I also admire the writing of these two chapters very much. I incorporated in my teaching of Chinese diaspora. I think the main contribution that she did is that she developed beyond Mandarin. She already have the concept about how those bachelors in Chinatown that actually have a transnational family, I mean, will stay at home wife through the operation of economic split economic household to remittance. I think in these two chapters, Shelly also analyzed how the transnational ideas of home, that is how that become interrupted after the establishment of socialist China in 1949. And many books published around 2018 also touch upon the notion about how Chinese diaspora went back home, that Karen Thiel's book and also Michael Williams' book published in the same year. But I think the most important contribution of the book is about how the transformation of China from old China to new China will redefine the notion of Chinese womanhood. I think that is what I see the most exciting finding in terms of how the diaspora time become inconsistent with the socialist construction of Chineseness after 1949. And the state interest, so but it's the Chinese socialist state was not the only, I think the government that's tried to construct the notion of being modern Chinese. And I think chapter 2 and chapter 3 also did an interesting contribution, that when China remained to be a weak state, I mean, before the completion of the Communist Revolution, and Jinan scholar, they already developed their discourses and to assume that China had colonized the South Seas or Southeast Asia. And here, I find it's a very interesting discussion is that instead of looking at that just as a part of nationalist construction, and Shelly cited look at the colonial circulation. I mean, in terms of how Japan's scholarship, Japanese views of South Seas shape the way that the Chinese nationalists come up with their discourses of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. And she cited especially Liu Shimu's use of Umetani Mitsuzada's argument. And Mitsuzada have two main arguments. First, Nanyang Huaqiao or South Sea Chinese were the hegemon of the South Seas. And the second thing is important to know is that Japan should use, I mean, how much the Japanese connection with Taiwan will shape the way Japan look at the Chinese in Southeast Asia. And I think this part is for a very unique, I mean, in the way to look at the Chinese national discourse with its connection with the Japanese inside. But I would wish to see a little bit further development of this point. I mean, given the fact that when Japanese South Sea scholar, I mean, based on, I think I got a lot of inspiration from two Taiwanese scholars, Li Manhong and Zhong Zhong's writing. And then they look at how Japan look at South Seas Chinese. They actually didn't think about them just as Chinese. They thought about them as Hogan. I mean, like a Hogan speaker. I think this part of analysis is some kind of missing, or I would wish to see more when Shelly mentioned how she think about modern China as also a construction of Chineseness in terms of the collection of different fragmented and network construction of identity. And if we want to substantiate the network part of Chineseness, I would see the language as a very important component. Like in chapter 1, for example, Shelly will mention about how Yongwen, his secret mission to Peru have something to do with Yongwen as a Cantonese, so as those migrants in the Americas. So I would think about why the Jinan scholar overlook the Southern speech group ties among the organization of Nanyang Huaqiao or the Southern Chinese, the Chinese in the South Sea. So I would rather think about it's more like a twist. So when the Japanese concept circulated to the nationalists, and the nationalists kind of reduced the emphasis about the Southern Chinese differences. And so as the Southern Chinese difference was also very important in Liang Qichao's writing. Like Liang Qichao mentioned like 8th grade Chinese colonists, and Liang actually talked about, emphasize their Southern origin. And Liang also have a thesis about how Cantonese will always went a step further than the rest of the Chinese. But Jinan scholars just didn't care that much about this part. So I think when Shelly used the terms about how Jinan scholars cement the notion of colonization with migration, I would rather think about it is how Jinan scholars twist, I mean, the original concept of migration. I mean, in China before the 19th century, only the Hogan and Cantonese left China. But when Jinan scholars make their discourses of Southern Chinese, that's just about 中国人. It's not about Cantonese. And Liang Qichao still care about Cantonese, but not the Jinan scholar. And I think this kind of reductionist, I mean, is a very interesting part that I think Shelly points about the transformation of the thought, but I think that is the direction. I mean, I'm very much looking forward to see how you think about this subject. I think here and there you mentioned a lot about the Southern Chinese speech group type, but I would just like to see more about this part. And also, and then when Jinan scholar kind of reduce Liang Qichao's emphasis about those speech group differences, and when the Jinan thought like further circulated to Singapore. Like my friend Leander C, she write a lot about the South Sea Society in Singapore, and Liu Shimu and I think Liu Shimu and Li Changfu were also founding member of that association. And so when the Qinan's ideas about the kind of generic Chineseness circulated from China to Singapore, and Singapore also pick up this kind of generic Chinese identity rather than, I mean, in Southeast Asia, they used to be very much care about their linguistic differences. So I just find this kind of, I mean, how the idea transformed in each stage of circulation, I mean, to be very exciting. I mean, so this chapter is also my favorite. Okay, so the other chapter 3 is about Lin Wenqing and Lu Xun. I think this is a very classical debate, but Shelly kind of treated them in, I mean, in a very nuanced detail. I mean, I really like how she praised Lin Wenqing's critics against preaching universalism against the backdrop of the oft-neglected topic about the colonial racial hierarchy between the European and the Chinese. I think this is the thing that I think many scholars, I mean, talk about the Singapore's being a cosmopolitan colonial public sphere. I mean, they will overlook the fact that Shelly points out in the book that before 1930s, actually non-European were not allowed to serve in the public sector. I think this is a very important background to know about why Lin Wenqing, as an Anglicized Paranaga Chinese with his high social standing, but he did not take his Western education, try to remodel his Chineseness, but he rather tried to draw his search of Chinese antiquity to redefine Chineseness. I mean, that is the part I find is very interesting. But the other thing that I would say is that Lin Wenqing did not, he was not the only scholar, or Shelly put Lin Wenqing among other Western educated Chinese intellectual in the 20th century. I mean, together like Hu Hongting, Wu Liande, I mean, in the rank of those who tried to modernize China through their reaction to Western universalism. But Lin Wenqing also had a connection with Kang Youwei's disciple Chen Huanzhang. So Lin Wenqing might discover Confucianism before Kang Youwei visited Singapore. But after that, Lin Wenqing formed close connection with the guy called Chen Huanzhang. And Chen Huanzhang, after 1911 revolution, so he got a PhD from Columbia. He was the last cohort of Jinshi degree holder, but he later got a PhD from Columbia, and he was important intellectual inspiration for Lin Wenqing's straight Confucian society in Singapore. And so for this kind of connection will actually show Lin Wenqing did not just act to search or define his Chinese antiquity alone. And he also joined the cohort of those activists in China who have questioned what the May 4th movement. And although Lin Wenqing, as Shelly rightly points out, that he has big concerns about Western, especially Christian universalism, but in 1920s, he did not support anti-imperialist movement. For example, like there was a big strike, the General Guangdong Hong Kong strike and boycott in 1925, 1926. And when Lu Xun was hired at Xiamen University, there was just the end of the movement. And Lin Wenqing was against the he was against Western universalism, but he never took side with anti-imperialist position. So I just wonder whether Shelly will be interested in kind of contextualize Lin Wenqing's diaspora moment in the political context. I mean, for example, like Lin Wenqing was the guy who was consistent, I mean, with his more like a right-wing approach of modernizing Chineseness as a diaspora. But his contemporary, for example, like Dan Gaggi, who founded Xiamen University, and Dan Gaggi actually went back to China in 1949. So what we consider as a rupture for the majority of diaspora, I mean, in terms of how their transnational household become an evidence of exploitation or backwardness. But Dengagi as a diaspora, his diaspora moment actually continued after 49. So I think that is the question I'm just interested to, I'm a sociologist. I mean, so I know that I respect and I really admire Shelly as a historian. That I feel that you try not to generalize the case, right? I mean, so you kind of emphasize the different, like the individual nuance and difference and historical contingent. But as a sociologist, I mean, we would like to see whether we can find the condition or situation against which the connection between China and Chinese overseas will be integrated, and one moment that they will be separated. I mean, I'm just asking this question as a sociologist. Okay, so overall, I really like the way I read the book as a very smart response to Shi Shumei's questions of how of the question of diaspora. I mean, like the emphasis on temporality, historical contingency, fragmentation, or save the term from essentialism. But I would want to invite Shelly, I mean, to join me with the investigation about the question of Hua. I think I read Shi Shumei's Against Diaspora, the article, less about or less successful in terms of against diaspora, but more successful in terms of the question of Chineseness. But in the article, she mainly focused on those ethnic minority in China, and they were not Han Chinese. But I would like to see more analysis and discussion. I mean, this is from my book. I mean, also from the Japanese survey, like the way Chinese is a generic term, but underneath the big Chinese community, there are several mutually unintelligible linguistic groups. And in the early 20th century, Hogan, that Dengagi is a Hogan, he claimed himself to be a patriotic Huaqiao. But so as the Hakka diaspora, for example, like the Wenhu, the Tiger Banking, or Situ Meitang, a Cantonese from San Francisco, they all define their Chineseness. They all develop their diaspora moment. But the way they look at China and the connection between them could not be reduced as a homogeneous one. So I actually don't have much comment to the book itself, but I just want to invite Shelly to think about this question with me. I hope my comments about her work in reference to other study published around this year will make sense. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Professor Guo, and especially for this, to think about how the discourse of Chineseness is being mediated in different circuits, like colonial circuits, but also like different, in different dimension as well. So now, Professor Chan, do you want to respond? And okay, sounds good.
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you, Huei-Ying. That was so wonderful that you stick so deeply into the work. And now I know you know much more than I do. I'm a little scared. I think I'll try to respond as much as possible. I think the point about the differences along native place, identities, and speech groups, right, is well taken. I think it's definitely, there's a huge reduction that is going on, you know, that you observed in chapter 2, that I probably have not spent, you know, much time engaging that part. My focus was really about colonial thought, how it entered China, Chinese construction national identity through diaspora. So to me, that part that, you know, I think you're right that saying that I'm primarily a historian of China, that I try to kind of respond to certain things in my discipline that perhaps from my point of view, colonialism has not been receiving its legitimate place in thinking about China and Chinese migration. So I think I definitely, my emphasis was on the part that you just put a finger on, and yeah, I don't think I've done much about native place, how it complicates and coexisted with these mobilizations. So but I'm grateful that you pointed out, and also you did a lot of work yourself, and so that I really think that I met my interlocutor like in this setting that we can really talk to each other. So I definitely think I agree with you. And I think, the concepts that you use in your work, like corridor, is also very important. That is offers another conceptual approach to engaging these connections and how to conceptualize it without falling into essentialist homogenizing tendencies. I think in the first part of your comments, you were asking if there's a Ten Kim chain that you mentioned. How to think about him? Like, I would look carefully at and for these things, that their own thinking, their own thoughts. If they say and if they assume so, I believe them. If they don't, I'll be very careful. Am I imposing my own view? So, I since I don't know this character very well, I think I wouldn't, make a blanket assessment about it.
I think my question is more about, because I think the great contribution of chapter 1 is how the Qing state's connection with the migrant worker shaped the way China defined as sovereignty. But I wonder, but given the fact that most of the ethnic Chinese or Huaqiao were in Southeast Asia, so I wonder whether the transnational emphasis or like a circular migration in Southeast Asia will actually water down the notion of the boundary, because sovereignty is more like the notion of boundary. And certainly the migrant worker with their caste background and those kind of torture of the coolie trade, they would need the support from the state. But in terms of those like those Paranaga or those elites, the bourgeoisie, those men, they are all men. So but the way I need to kind of travel back and forth. So I just wonder whether they will have kind of counter effect. I don't know. It's actually not really a question to you or a critique of the work, but I just try to hold a conversation with my work.
Great point.
And what would that all together? What would be the broad picture that we can draw from the history?
It's a great point. Actually, there were indentured labor that went to Southeast Asia, right? In large parts of the Southeast Asia. So, but it then highlights the unevenness of this type of articulation, right? This geography is very uneven. Like, how come that most of the discussion that are things that we know about indentured labor had to do with the ones going to the Americas and less on to Southeast Asia? And I think you're right. If we shift this locale, it will definitely change the story quite a bit. So yes, I'm just trying to follow these discussions wherever I could find them. I think you made a great point.
Yeah. Because one point, I didn't know whether I mentioned that in my comment or not. What I really like about your work is very ambitious. In the way that you kind of try to look at the transformation of China from the field of the global migration. But as a scholar, because I started my study based on Hong Kong, Singapore, more like a colonial site. And then I always struggle, to think about how my case can be generalized as an overall kind of Chinese diaspora, kind of global perspective. I did that in my teaching, but in terms of writing, I'm just kind of struggling to see whether my case study can be elevated into like a discourse about the global Chineseness as such. So I'm also trying to find answer from you. Get some inspiration. Yeah.
I think corridor is a great concept that helps us get away from the center periphery model that is so entrenched in the way that we think about China and Chinese immigrants, Chinese communities elsewhere. I think it's a great model to think about.
All right, awesome. So I guess we definitely can continue the conversation. And now we have two questions popping up in the Q&A box. So let's move on to the Q&A session. And let's see. All right, so let's see. All right, so we have a question from Fan Yu Hu from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. So I guess this question is also about this kind of like colonial circuit, and also in terms of this different discourse and expectation of being Chinese in diaspora context. So let me read the question. All right, thank you for your talk, Dr. Chen. Would you please talk a little bit more about how Pan-Asianism and the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere idea affected or not the overseas Chinese sense of nation during the wartime period? Did Wang Jingwei's regime affect how overseas Chinese conceptualize the Chinese nation?
Thanks for that question. So I think, one of the chapters that deal with, kind of Japanese colonial thought and about the overseas Chinese, and that's chapter 2 that just now Huei-Ying was saying, quite a number of assumptions that I was, kind of putting into my analysis. So I think to answer that question in one way, because I did not write about the war, and I think that could be a different project. But the idea is that the Japanese understood Southeast Asia to be a site of both Western colonial domination as well as Chinese commercial power. So the way that I understood it is that there's a great desire to try to co-opt or replace Chinese networks in Southeast Asia. And so it explains that the vast volume of studies of Chinese in Southeast Asia that the Jinan scholars were trying to copy, follow, and reinvent, translate. They do everything they could with this massive volume of Japanese knowledge about the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia. And I think that is quite unique, that the Japanese government in Taiwan especially spent so much effort to try to understand and map the communities and their affinities and their activities, economic activities mostly. So to understand that, I think the Japanese were well aware that they had to find some way to take advantage of these networks or replace them altogether. So I think that the most important example that I know from the war was how when they got to Malaya and Singapore, they really tried to destroy the overseas Chinese merchant power there. And completely replace it with an imperial hierarchy that placed the Japanese on top and others, colonial subjects such as Formosans, Taiwanese, as some of their kind of the most immediate subordinates or agents. So I think if you go to Singapore, it's just so much museum narratives about this period that was so destructive and damaging to the Chinese community, and a lot of oral stories that they have assembled. So I encourage anyone to look at it. Actually, that maybe in the future I will also look more closely at this wartime period so that I can answer this question better.
Awesome. So we have another question. Okay, so this is a question from Brian Bernard, who is a professor here at USC. So, so this is a question, I guess, is about the intervention of your work to diaspora studies, and then how to further examine and also continue to ask questions. So let me read the questions. Shelly, you can also see it in the Q&A box. So thank you, Professor Chen, for this wonderful overview of your very important book. I really like how you describe diaspora not as a static category, but as a series of moments when a connection to a homeland is made or imagined. Do you see this as revising the idea that the ordinary moment of diaspora is always the moment of departure from the ancestral homeland, the primordial dispersal? Or does this allow for the possibility of diasporas originating following multi-generational settlement in the so-called host societies through, for example, Sthenicization projects carried out by ROC national campaigns in the early 20th century, exclusion, assimilation, and racialization policies of host nations, and successive waves of new migrants that affect communities that have long settled or quote-unquote integrated. How might you redefine the diaspora applied to the cases of secondary diaspora, such as Sino-Vietnamese in France or Indonesian Chinese in Australia?
Thank you for the great question. So is diaspora, or does it always begin with the moment of departure? I think no. I think I try to do it in the book in such a way that thinking about temporalities that, kind of that they meet and they don't, or they meet or they don't. So I think there's a lot of fluidity of how diaspora is used. I tend to concentrate on this axis diaspora homeland relationship, and certainly it's not the only way to do it. So diaspora could also be a way to just simply talk about Chinese people outside of China, so that there's a way to talk about Chinese in the US, in Canada, in Australia, how they celebrate Chinese New Year or something. So I think it does not always have to begin there. Maybe it's an articulation that begins much later, or not at all. So I very much believe in the kind of fluidity and complexity, diversity. And I think diaspora is still useful so that it can capture all of these things, that the book of migration can have many chapters, many volumes, and does not have to have the same endings. So localization is definitely one of the themes, I think, that is useful and necessary to think about transformation. But localization sometimes also mutate into other things. So I think diaspora still remains useful, even in with an emphasis that we know and is very vital to an understanding of Chinese culture and identity globally. So I definitely would say that no, it does not have to begin. Actually, sometimes it, like for example, I before last year, I never heard of people say Hong Kong diaspora. And is it because Hong Kong people never migrated before? No. So I think it has other things that is, kind of animating that identification. And so for that reason, diaspora remains a possibility.
All right. So I think now we have a question, and it's specifically about because your work is actually at the intersection of different fields, like for example, Asian American studies or Chinese history or Asia area studies and histories, and also we have a question from Hyungju Lee, and then let me read the question. Thank you so much for your talk, Professor Chen. While writing your book, did you encounter any methodological, theoretical, or overall disciplinary tensions between Asian American studies versus Chinese history or Asian area studies?
Thank you. That's a great question. Not many people ask me that, and I'm happy to be able to answer it. I think I was very fortunate. I wrote this book when I was at UW-Madison, and there's a great kind of openness to all kinds of methods and approaches, and I think at the time my mentors were all not China people at all. So diaspora, migration, these are themes that were engaged long by African scholars, Africa scholars, Latin Americanists also. So I learned a lot in conversation to kind of have kind of a sense of confidence in trying to articulate what I mean from the Chinese experience, what can be learned. So to me, it's, even though there are much controversy, debates about diaspora as a concept, I truly believe that if we can understand what were behind it and then find a way to move forward, that could be a valuable contribution to the field. And so I talked a little bit about my article. I think at the time when I was writing it, a colleague was a little fearful for me because I was taking on some of the very important criticisms. But I think ultimately I decided, we needed concepts and frameworks, and I'm just joining a conversation that had been, started by people who came before me and then probably will continue after I'm gone. So I just have this idea that I'm just there to join a conversation. So as more people are reading it and telling me what they think, I think I heard a bit more. And so I think that there are tensions, that there are these things that I try to write about and respond to. They are there, and I treat them very seriously. I don't just dismiss them. So, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done to explain something that is so complex and so diverse, so contradictory, and as scholars, and our job is trying to recapture all of that.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we have more questions from the Q&A box, and let's see. So I guess this question is taking a closer look at your chapter 4, that is about those marriage and land reform and also socialism, and then how the Huaqiao and the Chaofu sort of interact or change these. So let me read the question. So the question is from Wei-Ling Deng. Professor Chan, thank you so much for writing the book and giving the talk tonight, and for sharing the picture of the book cake. Now you make all of this hungry. And I'm most interested in chapter 4 about Chao Zhen and Chao Fu, where you depicted the intersectional problems of socialist ideas and Huaqiao practice. My question is, through the negotiations with state power in events such as land reforms and marriage law, in what sense did the Huaqiao practice challenge or change the meaning of being Chinese during high socialism?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. I think in the 1950s, so temporality is very important to this, when something is moving very quick, as opposed to something that's very slow, that is kind of entertaining some kind of broader future where everything could be brought together, but it doesn't have to happen now. So I think that was something that I was trying to express, and I found in the social state approach to the Huaqiao problem. And in the early 50s, there's a lot of room to explore that. that that when they find something is going too hard and too rough, they roll back some of the measures. So, for example, you brought up children and the child food problem. That was when the socialist ideal is that women should be liberated from their unhappy marriages. And in a place like South China, it's filled with women who were married to their husbands that are overseas and they never see them. The classic model of this feudal patriarchal structures that oppress women. And of course, women should be given the right to divorce. So, but this whole campaign backfired because, and I think my findings match up pretty well with other scholarship that has been around about the marriage law, that it was practiced very unevenly, that young women were so eager to sever their ties with their overseas husbands that then it caused a lot of social anxieties about them and about the future of really ensuring the flow of remittances to the local economy. And then the state also kind of behind this ideal of just wanting to encourage happy marriages, meaningful marriages, conjugal arrangements. There was this broader objective of actually trying to ensure production would take place along model lines and that it would be state directed. So that project also then requires a form of family stability. If people are arguing and being upset all the time, it's definitely not conducive. And so some of these women would then ask to remarry men who cannot find wives. Then the women were really resisting. So that's a lot of, I really enjoy writing that chapter because the stories were just, how individuals reacted to these multiple pressures in their environments was so revealing of the local ecology of social arrangements and economic practices. So I think in the beginning, there was a lot of room to negotiate, to go back and forth, right? This on this kind of journey to reintegrate. That this area was allowed a degree of autonomy that unfortunately disappeared as socialism ramped up its speed, right? Kind of there's a greater pressure to conform to the model of socialist production, to produce, to engage in farming, cooperatives, so on and so forth. So I also pay attention to that kind of changing of how the suddenly sped up timeline unravels everything and cause a re-scrambling of temporal objectives. So I think that might have answered your question. I think that in the beginning there is this sense that they can balance these different timelines, hold them together. But as kind of China entered high socialism in the late 50s, early 60s, and continued during the Cultural Revolution, it just that space evaporated. And so, these Chinese women or the returnees, they were suspected of never going to arrive in this socialist future, that they were actually obstacles along the way. They just asked for too many things, too many accommodations, and that they have the potential bringing back a capitalist past that would contaminate us all. So that was a kind of, my book sort of ended there with that just kind of an inability to kind of coordinate this crisis that were spurred by not only Huaqiao practices, but socialist policies of integrating them and accelerating the speed of socialist construction.
All right, awesome. So let me double check. So we have one question that just popped out, and let's see. So this question is from Zhuo Ting Wen, and let me read the question. Thank you for bringing us this great book. I know that there was an Guangdong independence movement since Guo Zhijia's New Guangdong. Therefore, my question is, what was the homeland for the Chinese diaspora? Was it only related to home places of their ancestors? Were they concerned about the inner provinces of China at all? Were there many immigrants from the inner provinces to have their own voices in the diasporas? Or was the homeland, I mean, quote unquote, merely a timeless cultural construction based on the Chinese writing tradition?
That's such a great question. Yeah, I think that there can be multiple homelands of the diaspora. I think people generally say there are many diaspora, like diaspora in plural form, because we don't want to essentialize and we want to recognize plurality. There's no one single diaspora, but very few people would point out there's no one single diaspora's homeland either. So I think that the question that was asked, and also kind of sometimes I got pressed about the question of Taiwan. I think there's just still so much to do. Like I can only do so much in my book, but I think these are wonderful questions that homelands are created, not given. And so in my book, I was just trying to show how this national homeland, this ancestral homeland that seemed to have this appearance of permanence, how was it created? So I think I agree with all the things that you said, and the questions that need to be answered, need to be explored.
Oh, okay, all right, thank you. Yeah, so I guess while I believe some of the audience might be still typing their questions, and so I guess that I have the privilege to now ask my questions. So my question is actually very related to Zuoting, the question that you just answered, in a way that homeland, it seems to have this like fantasy, or this like as if a complete a picture of the one's place of origin. But as we know, and also as you discuss in your work, we know diaspora community is very diverse. But China is also going through different political stages. In the very beginning, it's a dynasty, and then secondly, it's a republic, and later on moved to a republic. So it's not, I guess you answered it when you respond to Zuoting's question, but my question is also thinking about this, like the diaspora's homeland, or this kind of like plural form of homelands, and especially in terms of political activism as well. So some of them want to reinstate the Qing dynasty, or some of them want to, for example, the nationalists, they are kind of like more leaning towards the nationalist party, and we see this still continuing conflicts in Chinatown in the United States, right? We have two different flags that fly just across the street to each other right now. So, so yeah, I think when Zuoting asked this question about a homeland as a cultural construction, but also in a way that there's a different political layer and dimension attached to that meaning for homeland, and especially how that homeland demand loyalty, and in this geopolitical time that have such a force on individual life as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I completely agree with you. I think if we're continue to be critical and reflexive about these constructions, then we're able to see a lot of things. There are many. There's a way to desegregate China as a territorial construction and think about which parts that immigrants, and there's those who are reinventing themselves as diasporic subjects, which parts are they really interested in and engaging, which parts not so much. So I think it offers new ways to think about the geographies that in which they were active and that they are trying to produce. So, for example, kind of I think I look at migrant geographies now that I think about the Nanyang or Gold Mountains. These are imaginaries that were not just constructed, but they were lived, that there's the material aspect to it too. So I think if we turn, analytical lens the other way, we could also ask about, kind of their conceptions of the parts that they pick out that speak to them and that resonate with maybe a political agenda, maybe a cultural connection that was constructed as their China, their homeland. So so I think that there's just so many possibilities.
Yeah, so let me check the time. Yeah, so feel free to join the conversation, Professor Guo. And so I guess now we have a little bit more time, so I guess I just keep asking you questions. Then such a incredible opportunity. So I am really interested in this figure of diaspora returnees. And then so in a way that they are not just diaspora community, they actually go back. And then, for example, Li-Ping Chen go back and then have this revival of Confucianism, and also as a educator as well. But somehow they have this, they are being seen as this kind of intermediaries, but also this kind of transcultural broker for the quote unquote this new or modern ideas, and also this China and their background. But I think in some of the cases you discussed that sometimes this proximity to modernity is being interpreted as a threat to the nation as well, in a way that they are different and they want is going to change the existing system. So I guess can you say a little bit more about the general reception of diaspora returnees back in China? I understand this is definitely varies very differently in different periods of time, but I thought I would just put the question there.
Yeah, that's a great one. It turns out, it's more complicated than we think. For people who, do not look the other direction, where people there's this, maybe we call it return, maybe we call it remigration or reverse migration or circular migration. If we do not look at that part, we could tend to assume it's a relatively unproblematic movement or a reconnection, that shouldn't these people automatically, be reassimilated, reintegrated. Turns out it's a very complicated process that in my own writing, my own research, they were marked as people who came back from abroad. And so they have a different history. They brought home a different history, different past, different set of politics and culture. So I think there's a great sense of awareness about that, instead of saying we're all Chinese, we're all gonna get along fine. So I think I'd like to point out that tension and source of conflict very much. And that these people will also have their own thoughts and their agencies, that their attitudes and toward China or to the other fellow domestic Chinese could be very different. So it then requires that we think about them as actors of their own right, that not only were they perceived that way, that they also engage and behave oftentimes that way. That sometimes it means it gives them a source of authority to criticize China because they have seen other things. They have other comparative frames of reference. Sometimes it means they push China to do certain things that would seem important to them. So I think that the tension is definitely there, that the problem of the returnees or re-migrants they're not that straightforward, that they provoked a set of tensions and politics.
May I follow your response for a question? Because I think you mentioned something about the changes in 1950s, like in the early part of 1950, there was still some space for, I think probably before the 100 Flower movement, there was still some space for like the returnees overseas diaspora to really have petition or some forces to the government, but not after that. So I wonder whether you see any kind of, I want to say influence, but how will they, the situation of those returnees will affect the overseas perspective about China. I mean, so that is, because in my readings about Deng Gagi, for example, like there is some kind of discussion about whether Deng Gagi did want to stay in China rather than go back at some point, and there are different kind of different writings about that. And I just wonder whether how their position or their declining influence in China will affect the way their overseas counterpart look at the meaning of China's turning socialist.
I think you're right that the return overseas Chinese were then considered as a source of information on China for those who are outside of it. So yeah, the story about Deng Gagi and his return, his very high profile return to Xiamen and the whole building of a park. It was, but then also the kind of conspicuous, kind of the way that he was not actually accompanied by family members, that he went by himself, that actually, kind of calls into question of kind of, how is this return kind of very highly managed, like tightly managed.
And he died in Beijing, not in Xiamen.
Yeah.
So I guess now it's time for us to sort of wrapping up the event. And thank you, Professor Chen, for sharing your wonderful work with us. And thank you, Professor Kuo, for offering insightful comments. And thank you, all of our audience, for joining us today from different time zones and sharing your questions with us. So now we were talking about returnees, right? So I hope you will return again and joining us in fall 2021 for the Sinophone series book talk. So more information will be available on our website. So hope to see many of you in the Sinophone series in the fall, and also maybe next week in the Sinophone conference. So stay safe and taking good care.
Thank you.